Thomas had seen many strange things in his lifetime. As a farmer living on the outskirts of a vast forest, he had encountered his fair share of wildlife. Deer wandering too close to his fields, foxes stealing from his chicken coop, and even the occasional wolf lurking at the tree line. But nothing had prepared him for this. It was past midnight when the storm began. Rain hammered against the tin roof of his barn, and the wind howled through the trees like a restless spirit. Thomas had been sitting by his old fireplace, sipping from a chipped mug of coffee, listening to the fire crackle, when Buddy, his aging shepherd dog, suddenly perked up. The old mutt, normally too lazy to react to anything short of a fox or a trespassing raccoon, let out a low growl and turned toward the barn. Thomas stiffened. Something was out there. Grabbing his raincoat and an old rifle that had seen more rust in action, he stepped onto his porch. The storm was relentless. Sheets of rain blurred his vision, but he could make out a dark shape moving through the downpour. It was limping. It was large, and it was headed straight for his barn. For a split second, he thought it might be a cow that had wandered from a neighbor's farm. But no. This shape was bulkier, heavier, and the way it moved, slow and deliberate despite its clear pain, sent a shiver up his spine. Then the lightning flashed, and Thomas saw it. A bear, a massive one. Instinct kicked in, and he raised his rifle, heart pounding. But the bear didn't charge. It didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. Instead, it staggered. It stumbled forward, its right front leg barely able to hold weight. Its fur was matted with dirt, rain, and something darker, blood. The creature was exhausted, wounded, and yet there was something in its posture, in the way it lowered its massive head, that made Thomas hesitate. That's when he saw it, clutched in the bear's jaws, barely visible beneath the curtain of rain, was something small, something fragile. Wet fur clung to a tiny body. A cub. Thomas froze. His breath caught in his throat. The mother bear was carrying her baby, and she was looking right at him. For a long moment, man and beast locked eyes. The storm raged around them, but Thomas felt as if time had slowed. She was pleading, not with words, not with sounds, but with those deep, weary eyes. His fingers tightened on the rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to retreat into his house and let nature take its course. A wounded bear was dangerous, unpredictable. Even in her current state, she could tear him apart in an instant. And yet, there was something about the way she held the cub. Protective, desperate. Something inside Thomas stirred. He knew what it was like to lose something precious. He knew what desperation looked like. The bear took another step forward, then another. Her legs trembled beneath her weight. She was close enough now that he could see the wound on her shoulder, a deep gash, likely from a hunter's trap or maybe even a fight with another animal. Blood seeped from the wound, mixing with the rain. She would not last long. Thomas exhaled slowly. Then, against every rational thought in his mind, he took a step back. He lowered the rifle. The bear watched him, wary but unmoving. The cub in her jaws let out a weak, pitiful sound, half a whimper, half a cry. She needed shelter. She needed help. Thomas knew he was making a mistake. He also knew he couldn't turn her away. He whistled for Buddy to stay put, then gestured toward the barn. He wasn't sure if the bear understood, but when he took slow, careful steps toward the large wooden doors, she followed. It took all his willpower not to panic, as the bear limped into the barn behind him. The scent of hay and damp would fill the air as Thomas quickly grabbed a lantern, illuminating the space. The bear collapsed onto the straw-covered floor with a deep, shuddering breath. The cub slipped from her jaws, rolling slightly before settling against her massive forearm. She was too weak to react. Thomas kept his distance, watching carefully. He had no idea what he was supposed to do. He was no vet, and he had certainly never tended to a bear before. But he could see she wouldn't survive long in this condition. Thunder rumbled outside. The cub let out another tiny cry, nestling closer to its mother's thick fur. It was smaller than Thomas expected, barely the size of a large house cat, its fur soaked and shivering. It wasn't just the mother that needed help. The baby did too. Thomas moved cautiously, his farmer's boots crunching against the straw. The bear lifted her head slightly but didn't growl, didn't move. She was trusting him. Or maybe she was just too exhausted to care. Either way, he grabbed an old blanket from the corner and carefully approached. Every step felt like a gamble. The mother's eyes followed him. But when he reached down and gently wrapped the cub in the blanket, she let out a tired huff, as if she understood. Thomas didn't know much about bears, but he knew what exhaustion looked like, what suffering felt like. This mother bear had gone through hell to get here, and she had done it for her baby. His throat tightened. She had come to the only place she thought was safe. She had come to him. Thomas worked quickly. He fetched a bucket of warm water, some old towels, and whatever first aid supplies he had on hand. The cub shivered as he carefully dried its fur, rubbing gently to warm its tiny body. Its small eyes fluttered open, dark and glossy, full of innocence. The mother bear watched him, her massive chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Thomas moved her next. The wound on her shoulder was bad. Not fresh, but not old enough to heal on its own. Infection had begun to set in. She had likely been suffering for days, dragging herself through the storm, through the wilderness, just to find refuge, just to save her cub. Thomas's hand shook slightly as he cleaned the wound. The bear flinched but didn't lash out. He worked as carefully as he could, his mind racing. She needed real care. But how? Who could he call? Who would believe that a mother bear had limped onto his farm, seeking help? He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that he couldn't let them die here. The mother let out a deep sigh, her head resting heavily on the barn floor. She was fading fast. Thomas finished cleaning her wound, covering it as best he could. It wasn't much, but it was something. The cub, now warm and dry, let out a small chirp, snuggling closer to her massive paw. Thomas sat back, exhaling. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, in the dim light of the barn, a farmer, a mother bear, and her tiny cub lay in silence. 3 souls brought together by fate, and one man determined to keep them alive. Thomas barely slept that night. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the barn, silence reigned. The mother bear lay still, her breathing deep but uneven, her massive body rising and falling with exhaustion. The cub, nestled against her, let out tiny murmurs in its sleep, its small frame shivering every now and then despite the warmth of the old blanket Thomas had wrapped it in. The old farmer sat on an overturned wooden crate a few feet away, rifle resting against his knee. He had no intention of using it unless he had no choice, but he wasn't foolish enough to ignore the possibility. A wounded bear was unpredictable. The only thing keeping him from pure terror was the way she had looked at him, like she understood she was safe here. Still, as he watched her, he knew she was slipping. She was too weak. The gash on her shoulder wasn't the worst wound Thomas had seen, but on an animal this size, in this condition, infection could set in quickly. Her body was already fighting exhaustion and hunger. She wouldn't last long without food or proper care. And the cub? The little thing had barely made a sound. That worried Thomas. A healthy bear cub should be more vocal, more alert, even if it was scared. This one barely stirred. Thomas ran a rough hand down his face, exhaling. He was an old man. He wasn't a veterinarian. He had no experience with something like this. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to walk away. With a grunt, he stood and walked to a wooden cabinet near the barn doors. He rummaged through his supplies, looking for anything useful. A few rags, an old bottle of whiskey, probably not great for drinking anymore, but good enough for sterilizing a wound. A roll of bandages that were meant for his livestock, but would have to do. He returned to the bear cautiously, his boots crunching softly against the straw-covered floor. She opened one eye as he knelt beside her. Thomas spoke softly, just as he would to a nervous horse. "You did good, girl," he murmured. "You got your baby here." That was the hardest part. She let out a deep sigh, her massive head barely lifting as he reached out. He took his time, letting her see his hands, letting her know he meant no harm. He dampened a cloth with warm water and carefully pressed it against the wound. The bear flinched, her muscles tensing, but she didn't snap. "That's it," Thomas muttered, working as gently as he could. "I know it hurts, but we gotta get you patched up." The wound was deep but not fatal. If she had been healthy, she probably would have healed on her own, but her body was too weak. She had lost too much blood, gone too long without rest or food. Thomas cleaned the gash as best he could, his callous fingers working with surprising gentleness. The bear's breathing remained slow and steady, her body too exhausted to resist. Once he was satisfied, he took a step back, wiping his hands on his jeans. The cub stirred slightly, making a small sound in its sleep. That brought up the next problem. They needed food. The mother bear was barely hanging on as it was. If she didn't eat soon, she wouldn't have the strength to produce milk for her cub. And if the cub didn't eat soon, it wouldn't make it through the night. Thomas sighed, rubbing at his beard. He didn't have much. The last thing he needed was to start feeding a bear food meant for his own animals. But what choice did he have? He walked back to the farmhouse, Buddy trotting at his heels, still uneasy about the new visitors. Inside, Thomas rummaged through his pantry. He grabbed a bucket and filled it with whatever scraps he could find. Some old cooked chicken, a few boiled potatoes from last night's dinner, even a handful of nuts. He knew bears could eat almost anything, but he had no idea what she would actually accept. He hesitated before reaching into his fridge and pulling out a carton of milk. If the cub wasn't nursing, he'd need to try something else. With a deep breath, he carried the bucket back to the barn. The bear barely moved as he set it down in front of her. She sniffed weakly, her body trembling. For a long moment, Thomas thought she might not have the strength to eat. Then, slowly, she nudged the bucket with her snout. Thomas held his breath as she took a tentative bite. Then another. It wasn't much, but it was something. When she had eaten as much as she could, she let out a tired huff and rested her head back down. Thomas turned his attention to the cub. He poured a small amount of milk into a shallow dish and nudged it closer. The little one sniffed at it, confused at first. Then, slowly, it began to lap at the milk. Thomas exhaled, relief flooding through him. They would make it through the night. Morning came slowly. The storm had passed, leaving the world quiet, damp, and eerily peaceful. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the barn walls, casting golden streaks across the hay-covered floor. Thomas stretched his sore limbs, realizing he had dozed off in the barn, his back resting against the wooden wall. His joints protested as he stood. The bear was still alive. That was the first thing he checked. Her breathing was steadier now. The food and rest had helped, but she was far from healed. She needed more. Thomas stepped outside and surveyed his land. The rain had turned parts of his fields into muddy swamps, but the worst had passed. He had work to do, chores, repairs, but all of that would have to wait. He needed to get these bears more food. After grabbing an old wooden crate, he set off toward the forest. It was a risk, leaving them alone, but he didn't have a choice. If he didn't find something substantial for the mother to eat, her strength wouldn't return. He knew the land well. He had spent decades hunting, foraging, living off what the earth provided. He gathered whatever he could. Berries from the edge of the woods, mushrooms he knew were safe, even some fish from a nearby creek. By the time he returned, the mother bear had lifted her head. She was still weak, but she was watching him now. He set the crate down near her, careful not to move too fast. "I don't know how long you plan on staying," Thomas muttered as she sniffed at the food. "But you ain't going anywhere until you're stronger." The cub let out a small chirp, clumsily pawing at a berry Thomas had placed nearby. The sight made him chuckle. He had no idea what the next few days would bring. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let them die. Not on his land. Not while he still had the strength to fight for them. Thomas had never imagined his simple life as a farmer would lead him to this moment, caring for a mother bear and her cub in his old barn. Yet, as the sun rose higher into the sky, golden light spilling through the cracks in the wooden walls, he knew there was no turning back now. The mother bear had survived the night, which was more than he had dared to hope for. Her breathing had steadied, and she had even managed to lift her head fully by the time Thomas brought more food. The cub, small and fragile, was beginning to show signs of energy. It toddled across the straw, nosing at its mother's fur, letting out tiny whimpers as if asking for comfort. Thomas watched them from a safe distance, his heart tightening. They had been through so much. And now, they were his responsibility. The next few days passed in a strange blur of routine. Thomas still had his farm to tend to. Chores didn't stop just because he had unexpected guests. But every morning, before he went about his work, he checked on the bears. At first, the mother bear barely moved, too weak to do more than eat a little and rest. But slowly, she began to recover. The wound on her shoulder had started to scab over, and though she was still thin and exhausted, her eyes held more life than before. She had even begun to watch Thomas more closely, observing his movements, her deep amber eyes filled with something that almost felt like curiosity. She was learning to trust him, and, in return, he was learning to trust her. One afternoon, as Thomas was chopping wood outside the barn, Buddy let out a sharp bark. Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead and turned just in time to see the barn doors shift slightly. The mother bear was moving. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself to her feet. She was unsteady at first, her wounded leg still weak, but after a moment, she found her balance. The cub let out a high-pitched squeak, thrilled to see its mother standing again. It bounced around her paws, nudging at her fur, its tiny tail flicking with excitement. Thomas set his axe down and stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. The bear turned to look at him. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. Thomas didn't know what to say. Not that she would understand his words anyway. But in that silence, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. She knew now that he wasn't a threat. And in that moment, Thomas realized something else. He didn't want them to leave. As the days stretched into a week, the barn became more than just a temporary shelter. It became a home. The mother bear, though still recovering, had begun to regain some of her strength. She ate more now, and Thomas had started leaving food outside the barn, encouraging her to move around and rebuild her stamina. The cub had grown bolder. It played in the hay, tumbling over itself, curious about everything. More than once, Thomas caught it nosing at his boots, its tiny claws pawing at the worn leather. He let it, though he never dared to reach out himself. The mother watched everything. She was protective, but not aggressive. She allowed Thomas to be near, to bring food, to exist in their space without fear. It was a strange kind of bond, one neither of them could have predicted. And Thomas found himself dreading the day they would leave. But the outside world was never far behind. One morning, as Thomas was tending to his fields, he heard a truck rumbling up the dirt road. He wiped his hands on his jeans and squinted toward the horizon. 2 men sat in the cab, hunters. Thomas felt his stomach twist. He had heard rumors of a wounded bear spotted in the woods. People had been talking about it in town, wondering if it was dangerous, if it needed to be taken care of. And now, they were here, looking for her. Thomas met them by the fence, his face carefully blank. "Morning," one of the men said, spitting onto the dirt. "You heard anything about that bear?" Thomas shrugged. "Heard about it, sure. Haven't seen much, though." The man squinted at him. "You sure?" "Word is, it's injured. Could be dangerous." Thomas forced a laugh. "If there was a bear that close, my dog would have raised hell by now." Buddy, as if on cue, let out a lazy bark from the porch. The men exchanged glances. "You let us know if you see anything," the other man said. climbing back into the truck. "We don't want any trouble." Thomas nodded, watching as they drove away, dust kicking up behind them. Only when they were gone did he let out the breath he had been holding. That night, he sat in the barn longer than usual, watching the mother bear as she dozed beside her cub. He knew this couldn't last forever. She belonged in the wild, not in his barn. But out there, she wasn't safe. Not yet. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He would give her more time. She wasn't ready to go. And, if he was being honest, neither was he. The days turned into weeks. The mother bear grew stronger. She walked without stumbling. She ate heartily. The cub had grown, too. Its tiny frame had filled out, its fur thick and glossy. It played outside now, bounding through the grass, rolling in the dirt. Thomas found himself laughing more often than he had in years. But he knew the time was coming. One crisp morning, as the sun rose over the farm, the mother bear stood at the barn entrance and looked toward the tree line. Thomas followed her gaze. The forest called to her. She was ready. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to accept what he had known all along. She didn't belong here. She had come to him in desperation. He had given her shelter, given her time. But now, she had to go. That evening, as the sky burned orange and pink, the mother bear took her first steps back toward the wild. The cub hesitated at first, looking between its mother and the barn. Thomas knelt down, watching them go. The mother bear turned back one last time. Their eyes met, and in that single, quiet moment, Thomas knew she understood. She wasn't just leaving. She was saying thank you. Then, without another sound, she disappeared into the trees. The cub scampered after her, its tiny form vanishing into the wilderness. Thomas sat there long after they were gone, staring at the empty space where they had stood. His barn was quiet again. His farm was just his own. And yet, something had changed. He would never forget them. And somehow he knew they wouldn't forget him either.